Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, the podcast where we explore the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. I'm James Carrington, and today we're telling the story of a remarkable young writer whose future once seemed limitless. At the age of 12, Barbara Newhall Follett had created her own imaginary world and written a novel that astonished critics across America. But as she grew older, the life she had dreamed of began slipping away. One day, she walked out of her home and vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that has endured for generations. Barbara Follett was born on March 4, 1914, in Hanover, New Hampshire. From the beginning, she grew up in a household shaped by language, books, and imagination. Her father, Wilson, was a writer, editor, literary critic, and university lecturer. Her mother, Helen, had worked as a teacher and shared her husband's love of literature. Barbara was largely educated at home, where her unusual intelligence quickly became impossible to overlook. While most children her age were only beginning to master the alphabet, Barbara was already becoming fascinated by words and the worlds they could create. By the age of 4, she was composing poetry. As she grew older, her imagination expanded far beyond the stories and games of an ordinary childhood. Barbara did not simply invent imaginary friends or isolated adventures. She created an entire fantasy world that she called Farksolia. It had its own landscapes, customs, history, and language, known as Farksu. She filled notebooks with stories and poems set within this private universe, developing it with an attention to detail that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a young child. Farksolia became more than a game. It was a place Barbara could enter whenever the ordinary world seemed too narrow or confining. In that world, she was free to wander through forests, travel across oceans, speak a language of her own invention, and live according to rules that existed only in her imagination. Nature occupied an especially powerful place in Barbara's inner life. She was captivated by forests, birds, mountains, and wild animals, and she often seemed more comfortable outdoors than she did within the conventions of ordinary society. To Barbara, the wilderness was not frightening or empty. It represented freedom. The natural world offered escape from expectations, restrictions, and the complicated behavior of adults. This fascination would shape nearly everything she wrote and, years later, would influence some of the theories surrounding her disappearance. When Barbara was just 8 years old, she began writing a long story as a gift for her mother. Its original title was The Adventures of Epersip, and its heroine was a young girl who felt imprisoned by the ordinary world. Epersip leaves her family and escapes into the wilderness, where she lives among animals and gradually becomes almost indistinguishable from nature itself. The story reflected Barbara's own longing for complete freedom, but it was far more sophisticated than anyone might expect from a child of 8. Working on a small portable typewriter, Barbara poured herself into the manuscript, carefully constructing Epersip's journey through forests, meadows, mountains, and the sea. Then, disaster struck. In 1923, a fire destroyed the family home and consumed Barbara's manuscript. The story she had spent months creating was gone. For many young writers, such a loss might have ended the project completely. Barbara, however, began again. Drawing on her remarkable memory and determination, she rewrote the entire book. The new version became even richer and more polished than the one that had burned. Her parents began to recognize that what Barbara had created was not merely an impressive childhood exercise. It might be worthy of publication. Wilson Follett used his experience in the literary world to help prepare his daughter's manuscript, but the voice and imagination within it belonged unmistakably to Barbara. The novel was eventually renamed The House Without Windows, a title that captured the idea at its heart. The wilderness itself was Epersip's home, a vast house without walls or windows, without locks, boundaries, or confinement. Alfred A. Knopf published the book in January 1927. Barbara was only 12 years old. The reaction was extraordinary. Reviewers did not treat The House Without Windows merely as a charming novelty written by a gifted child. Many regarded it as a genuine work of literature. Critics praised Barbara's command of language, her vivid descriptions of the natural world, and the strange, dreamlike quality of the story. Some reviewers compared her writing favorably with that of established adult authors. Newspapers carried stories about the young prodigy, radio programs sought her opinions, and readers across the country became fascinated by the quiet 12-year-old who had written such an unusual and haunting book. Barbara suddenly found herself presented to the public as a child genius. Photographs showed a serious-looking girl with dark hair and an expression that appeared older than her years. Journalists wanted to understand how someone so young could have written with such confidence and imagination. Yet the attention also created a contradiction that Barbara would face throughout her early life. Readers celebrated her because she was a child, but the work itself had emerged from her desire to escape the restrictions of childhood. Ypircip had fled from adults, domestic life, and the expectations of society. Now Barbara was being asked to perform the role of a remarkable little girl for reporters, publishers, and an admiring public. Her success continued. Barbara was invited to comment on other children's literature, and her opinions were treated with surprising seriousness. But she did not want to be remembered simply as a curiosity who had published one remarkable book at 12. She wanted to experience the wider world and continue writing about it. Adventure appealed to her as strongly as imagination. Before long, she would have the opportunity to leave the safety of home and undertake a journey that few children her age could have imagined. In 1927, Barbara and her mother boarded the Normandie, a lumber schooner sailing from New Haven, Connecticut, toward Nova Scotia. Barbara served as a cabin girl and observed the ship's crew, the changing weather, and the demanding rhythms of life at sea. The voyage provided the inspiration for her second published book, The Voyage of the Normandie, which appeared in 1928 when Barbara was just 14 years old. Unlike the fantasy of The House Without Windows, the new book was based on lived experience, but it displayed the same fascination with movement, freedom, and the natural world. Once again, reviewers praised Barbara's abilities. She had now published 2 books before most young people had even entered high school. To the outside world, Barbara appeared destined for an extraordinary future. She had imagination, discipline, intelligence, and access to a literary world that few aspiring writers could enter. At 14, she had already accomplished more than many authors achieved in a lifetime. It seemed entirely possible that the child prodigy would mature into one of the most distinctive American writers of her generation. But behind the public image of the gifted young author, Barbara's family life was beginning to fracture. The home that had nurtured her imagination was becoming unstable, and the father she adored was pulling away. The changes that followed would force Barbara out of the protected world of childhood far sooner than she was prepared for, and begin the long decline from celebrated young novelist to a woman whose disappearance would go almost unnoticed. The turning point came in March 1928. Just weeks before the publication of her second book, her father left the family after falling in love with another woman. For Barbara, the betrayal was devastating. Wilson Follett had been far more than a parent. He had been her mentor, her literary guide, and the person who understood her remarkable imagination better than anyone else. His sudden departure shattered the close bond they had shared and left Barbara emotionally adrift. Years later, friends would recall that she never fully recovered from the loss. The separation also created serious financial hardship. Barbara's early literary success had brought praise, but it had not brought lasting financial security. With her father gone, she and her mother struggled to support themselves. The glamorous image of the celebrated child author quickly faded as everyday survival became a far more pressing concern than writing novels. Barbara continued to write whenever she could, but publishers who had once eagerly promoted the young prodigy now seemed far less interested in the work of a growing young woman. The public had embraced the novelty of a 12-year-old literary sensation. As Barbara entered adulthood, that fascination quietly disappeared. Rather than surrender to disappointment, Barbara looked elsewhere for fulfillment. She found comfort in the same places that had inspired her imagination since childhood: forests, rivers, mountains, and the open sea. Adventure had always called to her more strongly than convention. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, she traveled extensively, often choosing experiences that most women of her era would never have considered. She worked aboard ships, hiked through remote wilderness, and embraced a life that valued freedom over stability. Those who knew Barbara often remarked that she seemed happiest when surrounded by nature, far from cities and social expectations. One of the most significant journeys of her life came in the early 1930s when she participated in an extended hiking expedition along the Appalachian Trail. At the time, the trail itself was still incomplete, and long-distance hiking was virtually unheard of. Barbara spent months walking through forests and mountains, carrying little more than the essentials she needed to survive. During the expedition, she met another young adventurer named Nickerson Rogers. Known to friends simply as Nick, he shared Barbara's love of hiking, exploration, and life outdoors. The two quickly formed a close bond. Their friendship gradually developed into romance, and in 1934, Barbara and Nick were married. At first, their relationship appeared to offer exactly the kind of partnership Barbara had always wanted. They shared long hiking trips, camping adventures, and a mutual appreciation for nature. Friends described them as energetic, intelligent, and deeply compatible. For a time, it seemed that Barbara had found someone who understood her desire to live an unconventional life. Yet marriage also brought new responsibilities and new frustrations. Financial pressures never completely disappeared, and Barbara found herself spending less time writing than she had hoped. Although she continued to work on stories, journals, and essays, the literary career that had once seemed destined for greatness never regained the momentum of her childhood success. She occasionally expressed sadness that people still remembered her primarily as the girl who had written The House Without Windows, while paying little attention to the writer she had become. As the years passed, cracks began to appear in Barbara and Nick's marriage. Friends later suggested that Barbara often felt lonely, even when surrounded by people. She longed for the freedom she had experienced during her travels and increasingly struggled with the routines of ordinary domestic life. The imaginative child who had once dreamed of escaping into endless forests now found herself facing financial worries, household responsibilities, and growing uncertainty about her future. The greatest strain, however, came from Nick himself. According to letters Barbara wrote to close friends, she had become convinced that he was being unfaithful. Whether those suspicions were entirely justified has never been established, but Barbara clearly believed her marriage was beginning to collapse. In one heartbreaking letter, she wrote that she felt she had come to the end of everything. The optimism that had once defined her youth was slowly giving way to disappointment and despair. Despite these struggles, Barbara didn't entirely lose her adventurous spirit. She still dreamed of traveling, of writing, and of reclaiming the sense of purpose that had guided her as a child. But by the autumn of 1939, those dreams seemed increasingly distant. Her marriage was under severe strain. Her literary ambitions had largely stalled, and she found herself standing at another crossroads in her life. Then, on the evening of December 7th, Barbara quietly left the apartment she shared with Nick in Brookline, Massachusetts. According to her husband, the two had argued earlier that day about money and the growing problems within their marriage. Barbara took only a small amount of cash, estimated at about $30, and left carrying little else. She wore a dark coat and carried a small notebook. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. It would be the last time anyone could say with certainty that they had seen Barbara alive. At first, Nick assumed she simply needed time alone. Barbara had always valued her independence and often sought comfort in long walks or time outdoors when she was troubled. As the hours passed, however, she failed to return. One day became several, then several days became weeks. Gradually, it became impossible to ignore the frightening possibility that something far more serious had happened. What happened next has puzzled historians almost as much as Barbara's disappearance itself. Nick did not immediately report Barbara missing to the police. Instead, he contacted friends and relatives, hoping someone had heard from her. Believing she would eventually return on her own, he waited 2 weeks before filing a formal missing person report. By the time authorities became involved, valuable time had already been lost. Potential witnesses were more difficult to locate, memories had begun to fade, and any physical evidence that might have existed was almost certainly gone. Barbara's mother, Helen, grew increasingly alarmed. She wrote letters to Nick asking what he was doing to find her daughter, and repeatedly urged him to press the authorities to continue searching. In one letter, she expressed growing frustration that Barbara's disappearance didn't seem to be receiving the attention it deserved. Helen feared that everyone except the family was slowly forgetting that Barbara had ever existed. Unfortunately, her fears were not entirely unfounded. In 1939, missing adult cases were often handled very differently than they are today. If an adult left home voluntarily, police frequently assumed they had simply chosen to begin a new life, unless clear evidence suggested otherwise. Barbara was 25 years old, and there were no obvious signs of violence inside the apartment. Without witnesses, a body, or evidence of a crime, investigators had little to pursue. The case received only limited attention before gradually slipping into obscurity. The lack of an early investigation created problems that can never be corrected. No comprehensive search was organized. There was no coordinated effort to trace Barbara's movements in the hours after she left home. Records that might have proven useful were never gathered, and many people who may have crossed paths with her were never interviewed while their memories were fresh. As the years passed, those lost opportunities became impossible to recover. Even Barbara's remarkable literary accomplishments seemed to fade from public memory. The child once celebrated as one of America's greatest young writers disappeared so quietly that many readers never learned she was missing. Her books eventually fell out of print after her disappearance, although interest in her remarkable talent never completely faded. Yet Barbara's family never stopped hoping. Helen continued writing letters for years, asking friends, publishers, and anyone who might have information to help locate her daughter. She refused to believe Barbara had simply abandoned everyone she loved without explanation. Until the end of her life, she continued searching for answers that never came. Today, more than 8 decades later, there has never been a verified sighting of Barbara after the evening she walked out of her apartment. No confirmed letters, no authenticated diary entries, no financial records, and no reliable eyewitness accounts have ever surfaced to establish what happened next. It's as though one of America's brightest young literary voices simply stepped out the door and vanished into history. That leaves us with one final question. What really became of the child genius who dreamed of living in a house without windows? One possibility is that Barbara chose to disappear intentionally. She had spoken often of wanting to escape the pressures and disappointments of her life. As a child, she had imagined a heroine who abandoned society to live freely in the wilderness. Some have wondered whether Barbara ultimately tried to do the same. Perhaps she boarded a train under another name, started over somewhere far from New England, and never looked back. Yet this theory raises difficult questions. Barbara had always maintained close relationships with her mother and other family members. Although deeply unhappy in her marriage, there is little evidence that she wished to sever every connection to the people who loved her. Had she intentionally begun a new life, it seems very unlikely that she would never again contact her mother, who spent years desperately searching for her. Another possibility is that Barbara took her own life. Her surviving letters reveal periods of profound sadness and emotional exhaustion, particularly during the final months of her marriage. Some historians believe those struggles may have left her vulnerable to despair. But here, too, there is no evidence that provides a clear answer. No note was ever found, no location has ever been identified, and no physical evidence has emerged to support that conclusion. Others have suggested that Barbara may simply have met with an accident. It was December in New England. She frequently walked long distances alone and was comfortable exploring unfamiliar places. A fall into a river, an isolated wooded area, or another remote location could, at least in theory, explain why no trace of her was ever discovered. While possible, that explanation remains entirely speculative. Then there's the possibility of foul play. Barbara left home alone carrying very little money. If she accepted a ride from a stranger or crossed paths with someone intent on harming her, she could easily have become the victim of a crime that was never connected to her disappearance. Unfortunately, because the investigation began so late, there is almost no evidence with which to evaluate that possibility today. Some researchers have questioned whether investigators looked closely enough at Barbara's husband, Nick. After all, Barbara reportedly disappeared after the couple argued, and weeks passed before he filed a formal missing person report. From today's perspective, those circumstances naturally invite scrutiny. Yet despite decades of speculation, no evidence has ever surfaced publicly linking Nick to Barbara's disappearance, and there's no record that authorities ever identified him as a murder suspect. In truth, every theory suffers from the same problem. There's simply not enough evidence to prove any of them. Perhaps that is why Barbara's disappearance continues to fascinate historians, readers, and lovers of unsolved mysteries. It's not merely because a young woman vanished without a trace. It's because the woman who disappeared had once been celebrated as one of the brightest literary talents of her generation. Her disappearance froze her story in time, leaving us to wonder not only how her life ended, but what extraordinary books she might have written had she been given the chance. Although Barbara's books fell out of print for many decades, renewed interest in her life and extraordinary talent led to their republication in recent years. Today, The House Without Windows, The Voyage of the Normandy, and even her previously unpublished novel Lost Island are once again available. They're introducing new generations of readers to the imagination of the remarkable girl who created Farxolia and dreamed of living in harmony with nature. Her journals, letters, and manuscripts have been carefully preserved, allowing us to glimpse a brilliant mind whose promise seemed almost limitless. Yet, for all that survives of Barbara's writings, the final chapter of her own life remains unwritten. Perhaps somewhere, hidden among forgotten records or overlooked memories, the answer still exists. Or perhaps Barbara Newhall Follett carried the truth with her into history, leaving behind only questions that can never be answered. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Echoes of the Unknown. If you found this story compelling, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with fellow mystery lovers. Your support helps us continue exploring the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries, one story at a time. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the greatest mysteries are hidden in lives that quietly disappear, leaving behind only echoes of what might have been.